This meeting is being recorded.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Luke Brett. I'm a project director on the Reuters Events Energy team. Today, we're hosting a webinar on simulation, leading the way to a cleaner future, where we'll be examining the advent of digital solutions across the energy spectrum and look ahead to the future of simulation and digital technology. A quick note to say that we'll be taking audience questions throughout today's webinar, so please make sure that you submit your written questions through the Q&A box available at the bottom of your screen. But for now, I'll waste no time in getting started, and so I'd like to hand over to our moderator, Prith Banerjee, who is the Chief Technology Officer of ANSYS. Prith, over to you.
Thank you very much, Luke. And again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you here. I'm Prith Banerjee. As Luke mentioned, I'm CTO at ANSYS. But prior to my role, I have worked for about 4 years. I used to be CTO at ABB and also CTO at Schneider Electric. So I've worked in this general area for more than 10 years. And today, our topic of conversation is very, very relevant, very interesting. There's a lot of discussion about reducing the carbon footprint. There's a Paris Agreement and so on. And everybody in the energy industry is sort of struggling through how we'll get there, right? How we'll get to that point. And we all know that the sort of answer is through digitization. So when I was at ABB and Schneider Electric, we used to talk about the 3 Ds in this area: the decentralization, the decarbonization, and the digitization. And essentially, I think that we will talk about those 3 Ds during our conversation. So as we know in the energy industry, again, we have discussions, we have panelists from the oil and gas industry, from the renewable industry, and so on. So as we talk about the energy sort of generation through delivery, right? We talk about the upstream, midstream, downstream, and so on, right? All those processes are being digitized, and essentially we have an integrated system that will reduce waste, that will streamline resource management, and essentially maximize efficiency. So we are going to talk about all of that. But as our colleagues in the energy industry are working on those solutions, there is a role for simulation, right? Where we believe that simulation has a very, very important role to meet your low carbon, your net zero objectives. And so that's essentially what we'll go about. We'll talk about the whole role of digitization in the energy industry, in oil and gas and renewables, and the role that simulation plays in this area. So I'm excited to introduce the panelists. We have here Dan Jevons, who is the VP of Computational Science and Digital Innovation at Shell. We have Patricia Rangel, who is a VP of Intelligent Operations from BP. And we have Boris Schubert, who is the Chief Development Officer at Silicon Ranch, and absolutely excited to bring this panel to you. So let me start with asking each of the panelists to kind of explain their brief background, their role and their company. So let me start with you, Dan. If you can do a quick introduction, please.
Yeah, so it's great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Dan. Current role, really, I look after all of the things that are future-looking around digital technology and, of course, computational science. In terms of background, I started out life as an Accenture consultant, did a variety of roles, ended up leading the advanced analytics COE within Shell, which I built up to being a significant community now. So I was general manager for data science before I took on this role. So background really in trying to bring together data engineering, data science, and now computational science to drive business value, but have been very close to the digital transformation journey we've been on as Shell.
Fantastic. Patricia, your background, please.
Hello, so I'm Patricia. I'm the Vice President of Intelligent Operations in BP. I'm a petroleum engineer by background, so I've worked in the field across different parts of the production system, including major projects, operations, and all the kind of startup production optimization. I've done simulation in the old days in my career as well, done a lot of that. I work in BP, company that, as you may have heard, I guess, is transitioning to an integrated energy company. We're going through the biggest transformation in our more than 100-year history. We're really focused at the moment on providing safe, secure, affordable and low carbon energy, so significant transformation. The whole profile of energy investment is changing significantly. So I'm really looking forward to the panel and the conversations we're going to have here today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Boris, your introduction, please.
Good morning, everybody. Boris Schubert, Chief Development Officer of Silicon Ranch and the chairman of our subsidiary ClearLoop, which is managing our carbon solutions. Silicon Ranch is really here in the US, a leading provider of climate and renewable power solutions. And we have about 4 gigawatts of projects under contract in construction or in operation. We have about 150 operating facilities in 16 states, coast to coast. And it seems Dan and I go way back. Not only have I been with Shell and have been running Shell's onshore renewables development activities for quite some time, I started my career at Accenture as well. So technology background there, and excited over the last 15 years to bring this growth mentality into the renewable power industry.
Fantastic, Boris. So, and a little bit of my background and my role as CTO at ANSYS. ANSYS is a modeling and simulation company. We take the world around us, which is governed by the laws of physics. We simulate the physics with numerical methods, and we have solutions for structural physics, we have solutions for fluids physics, we have solutions for electromagnetics, and so on. And in my role as CTO, I'm looking at the future technology directions, including things like AI, machine learning, and high performance computing. I know, Dan, you are a computational scientist, so those are the kinds of things that we bring to our customers. But an area that I am personally sort of leading at ANSYS is our initiative around sustainability. So this particular discussion topic today is at the core of what I'm looking at today. So thank you very much, panelists, for joining this discussion. So we have a lot of topics that I want to cover, and in sort of 3 broad areas. So the first area is, in general, the whole area of decarbonization, right? I mean, this is at the heart of the Paris Climate Accord and so on, and carbon management. We are talking about carbon capture, carbon reductions, and so on. So let me go around and ask each of you, how high a priority is decarbonization, carbon management in your organization, in your respective companies? I guess, Patricia, you kind of started talking about it, but let me start with you, Patricia, when we ask each of you to answer this broad question and then have sub-questions to talk about. Patricia?
Thanks, Brett. So as part of our transition to an integrated energy company, we announced a new strategy where by 2030, we are aiming to be a completely very different kind of company. We are decarbonizing and diversifying our business. We've been historically, as I mentioned before, an oil and gas company. We are actually becoming an integrated energy company. Our aim is to be net zero by 2050 or sooner across operations, production and sales. Our sustainability agenda is actually a foundation of our strategy. We have defined 20 aims to help us get to net zero and to also help the world get to net zero. We're also looking at improving the quality of people's lives and to care for our planet. So the 20 aims are all around the overall sustainability agenda. We will reduce our oil and gas emissions. That's one big part of our agenda. We are high grading our portfolio. We are growing bioenergy. We're working hard. Every single person in our organization is really focused at the moment on reducing emissions. But we're also investing in low carbon energy. So we'll continue to rapidly scale up our solar and offshore wind business. We're further developing opportunities in carbon capture and hydrogen. So we're planning to increase our investment significantly in the low carbon side of the business. So quite a significant transition for BP. So that tells you a bit of how important that agenda is for BP. It's at the core of our strategy.
Thank you, Patricia. And I would imagine that Shell is also having a similar thing. So Dan, your thoughts on this topic. How important is decarbonization to Shell?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's fundamental. And I think, we're going through a very similar journey to the one that Patricia described. I think we've set very similar aggressive targets, similar to BP. We want to be net zero by 2050 or sooner. We've also set up very clear targets around our scope 1 and 2 emissions, where we want to reduce those by 50% by 2030. And we're growing some very, very substantial businesses. So, we're now looking after about 10% of the global capacity in terms of hydrogen electrolyzers. We're, of course, accelerating the development of our EV charging network. We've said we want that to be 500,000 by 2025 and 2.5 million by 2030. So almost wherever you look across our business, you can point to radical transformations in the sort of business we're operating and really aggressive growth targets in terms of moving towards lower carbon sources of energy.
Absolutely. And so now let me go to Boris, who is, I guess you have been born in the new industry about renewables. So tell us, Boris, about how important, I mean, this is, I guess, your primary role. So your thoughts from his company. First of all, talk about why Silicon Ranch. That is a very interesting name. You live in Silicon Valley. How come the company gave the name Silicon Ranch?
So 11 years ago, when Silicon Ranch was founded in Nashville, Tennessee, when you think about where the main source of components is coming from PV panels, that is where silicon is coming from. While here in Silicon Valley, we think about chips when we hear silicon. Of course, in the renewables industry, when you hear silicon, you think about PV panels. So that's the silicon. And the ranch is really, if you think about what we do, we talk about PV power plants, but de facto, we are talking about solar ranches, right? So we're talking about large swath of land, which we at Silicon Ranch own all of our land, which makes us quite unique in the industry and which gives us quite a number of levers to play with. And I think we will talk about this in a moment when we talk about regenerative energy, carbon sequestration, all those tools we have at our disposal because of that. But to your question about how important is decarbonization, carbon management for Silicon Ranch, I think in a nutshell, it's the sole reason we exist, right? So this is the core of our business. This is the focus. We are solar focused. We are focusing on decarbonizing the grid, which is one of the biggest lever we as society have in order to advance our energy transition. And we do that in a way that we put the community in the center, right? So work with the local communities, becoming member of the community by being owners of the land and really align with the long-term vision and goals of those communities.
Fantastic, thank you. So now let's just sort of, again, as companies are setting these objectives of we'll be net zero by 2050, we'll make some progress, right? I mean, so let me ask you a question around sort of how can simulation help you in that journey? So where along the value chain has simulation assisted in your decarbonization effort? Let me start with you, Boris, to share your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Prith. So when you think about the journey of a project, when you think about planning, which takes quite some time because you need to bring your land, your permitting, your interconnection, your funding together in order to then construct the project, which will operate 30, maybe even 40 years. There is a lot of simulation necessary during the planning stage, which is on the one hand focused around the prediction of the output of the PV plant. So everything related to yield analysis and running different scenarios against different weather patterns is really, and has been for more than a decade, the core of what we do in the solar industry. While the industry has been growing and our projects have become larger and we became active members of the grid, a lot of the analytics around where is the optimized point of interconnection from a power grid perspective became more and more important. And just recently, and I mentioned earlier that we at Silicon Ranch have a partner company called ClearLoop, which is focusing on carbon solutions. The topic of emissionality became more and more relevant. And emissionality in a nutshell is telling you the degree of carbonization of a grid. So where does the deployment of PV plants make the most sense in order to drive the most carbon out of the biggest emitter of carbon in the US? And there's a lot of simulation around this emissionality, how it's going to play out, and how our deployment of solar farms can have a positive impact on that. And then, of course, last but not least, and I think we will talk about this also in a bit, during operations, there is a lot from a preventive analytics perspective that you can do, and to lead to preventive maintenance, to really ensure that your plant operates as planned. And if you tie all of this together, this is what sometimes in the industry we call bankability, which is incredibly important from a scale perspective for the industry, to assure and provide the trust and be the trusted partner to your carbon and power partners, that you can correctly predict the performance of your plant, both on the renewable energy side and by extension on the carbon reduction side.
Thank you, Boris. Again, you kind of talked about the use of simulation for solar, but I mean, the same things apply for wind as well, as you know, right? So when you have a wind turbine, the air goes on the wind, and so that is modeled through some fluid dynamics, and then in response to that, the blades start rotating. So that's the mechanical part, right? How much bending is happening, and then because of it, the electromagnetic power generation is happening. So you can do the same thing for a wind turbine, and then you look at a wind farm, which is a whole bunch of things, and you can look at really predict how much energy output will happen in a wind farm through simulation. So you're absolutely on it. So let me ask Dan here about sort of in Shell, as you're doing all these computational management and so on, how effective is carbon management in your role towards carbon management, right? Requires simulation.
Well, it's a great question, Prith, and I think maybe to sort of unpack this a little bit, what's worth talking about is the trajectory that we're on around carbon in general. And I think most of the folks on the line here will know that a lot of the historical mechanisms for quantifying carbon have been largely based on estimates versus actual measurements. And I think that's something that's fairly widely known. I don't think that will be new to many people. But that's purely just because it's quite hard to measure the actual emissions. I think we're on a journey with this one, because I don't think that society is going to let us maintain continue to focus purely on estimation. There's going to be a requirement to measure it, even though that's difficult. And I think we all know here that measuring everything through an end-to-end process is going to be really difficult, because these processes are vast. They run over many kilometers. They have millions of miles of piping in them, and measuring all of that and the emissions factors associated with it is going to be very, very difficult across the energy sector. And also, of course, that's not to rule out also the supply chain. And so I think there's a few things that are going to be really important about this. I think the first thing is finding ways in which we can develop consistent models of this and common data standards. And then to your point, Prith, one of the things that's going to be very important is being able to simulate different scenarios and to improve the estimation that we have where we lack data. And so I think it's going to be a combination of a variety of things that are going to be important to carbon management in the future. I also think other areas that are going to be very important is things like estimation of leaks and moving towards a situation where we're actually able to quantify those precisely and simulate the impact of those things. So I think what we're seeing is that transformation from a historical position where a lot of the carbon management has been estimation based to having much greater data in a variety of degrees of granularity at multiple different scales, to a position whereby we're actually starting to use simulation to give much more accurate quantification of the CO2 intensity throughout an entire end-to-end process within the energy sector. And when I say that, I'm talking here about almost any process, from refining through to wind farms, through to retail stations. I think we're going to have to look at all of that, and I think society is going to expect us to look at all of that, because it's going to be really important that we get a handle on that end-to-end business that we operate.
Thank you, Dan. In fact, as you're saying this, I was thinking about some of the, as I talk to various customers in the energy area, right? They have also always mentioned that if they could put a sensor in every part, right? Every pump, every compressor, if you can put a sensor, you can obviously measure a lot of stuff, right? But it's very expensive. So the question is, if you could put sensors only in 10% of the places, can you virtually, using virtual sensors, predict, right, through simulation, what the output of those sensors will be, and therefore you reduce the cost, but you get your output at the same level of accuracy, which sort of brings me to my next question. Let me ask you of Patricia, right? People talk about digital twins in different areas, right? Where do digital twins fit in your organizational picture at BP?
Thanks, we've been working actually on digital twins in BP for quite some time, and actually by our definition, the digital twin is basically a virtual replica of the physical asset. And the key enabler to that replica is your data. I think, Dan, you mentioned the importance of bringing your data together to be able to model the system performance, and to be able to predict performance of that system. We have historically, and we've had a lot of success with simulation and digital twins in the past. With our production system, there's one example that we have mentioned many times, where we've simulated our end-to-end production system and have created chain simulation of all the way from the reservoir to the export system in our production facilities. Now, BP needs to, and the industry needs the oil and gas business to be quite resilient, which means low carbon, which means efficient and cost efficient, basically. And as we build our digital twins of the facilities, one of the key things we are working now to do is to make sure that when we optimize the system, we optimize for all variables of the system, for all fluids in a facility. So we actually look at, and that's the concept that we're calling carbon aware operations. Basically, as we run our facilities, we are very aware of the carbon impact of every one of our operational decisions. So that's where I think digital twins are becoming quite important, because we are using them as a decision-making tool for our operations. So in the resilient hydrocarbon business, that's becoming actually a very important tool to inform, to augment the decision-making process of our engineers. It will be equally important. I think the digital twins will be equally important in our convenience and mobility space, and also in our low carbon energy. I think, Boris, you mentioned, I guess in the design of those facilities, they will be extremely important as well. So in the future, we will move to integrated energy systems. So open data standards and interoperability of different systems will become more important, so that we continue to simulate and optimize the overall system.
Thank you, Patricia. Again, I serve on the board of this founding board of the Digital Twin Consortium, and as we do this, everybody's talking about all these the things that you kind of mentioned. So obviously, we talked about the industry, how it needs to move toward decarbonization, carbon management. We talked about some of the use of simulation, but let's kind of switch gears to talk about some of the practical use of simulation, right? So there's the vision. This is what we think digital twins can do, and this is where. But I want to kind of ask all of you about sort of how has simulation technology improved your efficiency, right? Today, practically, you have if you can show some actual insights. So let me start with you, Boris, right? In the renewable industry, etc., right? How has simulation practically helped you in building products, in measuring efficiency, and so on?
Let me give you two examples. So the one is really about simulation of grid behavior and flow analytics, which determines where to best deploy a solar plant within the grid. And we use it very early on in the process to identify where and how much of solar power can be put into the grid and can be sold to our customers there. The other piece is really when you look at the operation side, where we are using a lot of simulation to predict, depending on different voltage levels on the DC side, what temperature to expect. And of course, all kind of surrounding parameters for that. And deviation from that prediction or simulation gives us a pointer, a first pointer where we might have a potential issue in the solar array, and can then really from a preventive analytics perspective and preventive maintenance perspective, improve the overall uptime of the system. The combination of the two is really then when you think about the decarbonization of the grid, which is not only the theoretical prediction, but really to optimize your performance to meet or even exceed your goals. So the combination of those planning and operational simulation approaches really are the foundation of the promises and the delivery that we do on those promises.
Fantastic. So Dan, in your role as you're leading your center of excellence at Shell, right, and so on, right, and you're again, this is at the core of what you run, right? So as you have started using simulation, have you actually seen some practical examples of simulation changing the business, right? I mean, Shell's business, you are going in one direction, through simulation, you have found something, oh my God, let's change it. So can you share some examples of the practical use of simulation for the business changing course here? And then I'm going to ask Patricia a similar question, BP's perspective.
I mean, I guess one thing to say, Britta, maybe to put context to this is that, as you rightly point out, simulation is more or less wherever you look in my department. And so there's a lot of things that we've been involved in. And that's from really, really simple things, simulating the amount of spare part inventory that we hold, and coming up with a whole series of scenarios of what's the worst case scenario, and then can we adjust safety stock levels to reduce the amount that we're holding. And we've seen savings of as much as 13% in our ability to reduce safety stock simply using those sorts of approaches. But similarly, we also do some really, really complicated things that are right at the other end of the spectrum. And so, for example, recently, we've just launched a new ethane cracker in our ETCA campus, which is our Amsterdam campus. And that ethane cracker basically is electrified, and it can reduce the emissions associated with that particular unit by as much as 350 kilotons per annum, we estimate, which is pretty big. And so the opportunity to do that sort of work, again, is all powered by simulation. So in this particular case, we're developing a reduced order model that's helping us to optimize the overall design of that unit and to cycle that through very, very quickly, which reduced the overall development time very, very substantially. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, from our perspective, we've got things that go right from the very, very simple in the simulation to the very, very complex. But to your point on, do we often make different business decisions? That's also very much part of it. So, within the supply chain, within the design of facilities, we're invariably running a whole raft of different simulation studies to start to identify different scenarios and then to adjust the planning in accordance with that, very similar to the way that Boris described it. But what I was trying to give is just a range of the sorts of things where we use advanced simulation methods to make different decisions.
Absolutely. Hey, let me ask you, Patricia, a related question, right? I mean, are you using simulation to find some novel uses, right, at BP, rather than just practical uses? Okay, everybody knows we can do it for, say, digital twins and so on, but some very, very interesting novel cases of simulation in your business.
Actually, we're working one with ANSYS, by the way, Chris. So there is a lot of work that we have actually ongoing with you in BP. We use simulation in many different ways. I guess we've historically used the physics-based model simulation in many paths. We've used it to monitor like pipe erosion or risks to the integrity of our pipes. Because one of the key things which we try to we do regularly is to make sure that we keep hydrocarbons in the pipe. That's extremely important. So the integrity of that system is quite important. So we use simulation a lot in that space. We use simulation to monitor fluid dynamics. Again, another brilliant examples with ANSYS, I guess. We use simulation to understand the impact of changes in the system so that we can predict when there could be issues in the operations. We also used reservoir simulation. Actually, is quite a skill I think we have in BP in particular. We've used it in the past to select and design our major projects, and we are using it heavily now as well in our carbon capture and storage opportunities. So the range of opportunities is quite significant. The novel use of simulation in our case now is the combination of the traditional simulation methods with reduced order models, with integrating them into digital twins and making them, converting that data into virtual sensors that we can then use to inform day-to-day decisions making, so optimization decisions. So it's making it to run faster so that they become a tool for daily decision making. That's the investment we have ongoing, is that integration of big simulation techniques with our day-to-day decision making through digital twins.
Fantastic. And I'm so glad, Patricia, you mentioned that, because in my role as CTO at ANSYS, we are sort of exploring the use of simultaneously sort of bringing together, fusing data analytics based sort of approaches to digital twins with sort of simulation based, right? Because in the industry, when I was a CTO at ABB and Schneider Electric, we used to put a lot of IoT sensors on assets, collect data, and based on it, try to predict what is going to happen to that asset. But if you combine that with physics-based stuff, right? I mean, these hybrid digital twins and so on can actually give you much more accuracy. So that is clearly a direction that we are also headed. That's sort of a novel use. Let me give you a heads up to all the people who are attending that we will go to switch to audience Q&A in about 10 minutes. So please submit your question on the chat session. And so we'll take your questions in about 10 minutes as I try to wrap up some initial set of questions that I'm asking the panel. So this would be a good time to kind of change gears here and talk about the future of simulation, right? Like again, Patricia, you started going in that direction, right? So clearly, each of your companies, right, have looked at, well, yes, decarbonization, carbon management is important, and you have sort of said, okay, yes, simulation can help you in your journey towards this net zero by 2050, et cetera, and making progress in that area. Do you see sort of, let's talk about the future, the next, as you go towards 2050, right? Will simulation continue to be a primary investment in years to come? Let me start with you, Dan.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is certainly a key area for us, and maybe just to outline sort of, you know, where we see this all going. I think you started to articulate it somewhat, Prit, as well. I think it's relatively obvious that the digital twin environment as it is today is largely a simplistic data-driven one, and most of the rollouts of digital twins focus on what we call level 1 and level 2 digital twins. In other words, simple data or data plus images, or at best data plus images plus some form of sort of basic physics. I think at the same time, we've seen that in the scientific community, there's been this ongoing development of physics-based digital twins, which are much more sophisticated in terms of the reduced order modeling type approaches that they use, and retain much more integrity around the physics, but at the same time lack the data context and operational environment. To me, it seems relatively obvious that you want both. And I would add to that another thing that I think you also want, which is you want the AI to be able to help to diagnose, to predict, to integrate, to generate synthetic data that we don't otherwise have about the twins. So if you ask me where I believe it's all going to go, I believe that the physics-based digital twins will integrate with the data digital twins. We'll have a combination of a physics-informed three-dimensional environment, which will allow us to be much more intelligent decisions about the energy assets that we operate. And on top of that, AI and machine learning will play a critical role in helping us to add intelligence to those things and to provide support services to operators, to planners, to schedulers, and the like. So that's really where we're looking to go. I think it's going to take some time. I'll be honest and say I don't think the technology is really there yet. But I think direction of travel, you can see where it's all headed, and it's a very exciting future.
Absolutely. Anybody else? Boris, would you like to say a few words about the use of simulation in years to come?
So I think I appreciate Dan's holistic description of the future and the digital twin from a data perspective. We do see on a practical level quite some very tangible opportunities in the future. And one, for example, is around the soil of the land that we own. So while we are generating solar energy and while we are decarbonizing the grid, we have an opportunity through actually holistic land management to use the soil as a carbon sink to sequester. So to model and monetize this opportunity, we need to simulate the carbon cycle around our holistic land management activities. And for the folks in the call for whom holistic land management sounds slightly too abstract, we are proud owners of flocks of sheep. And these sheep graze the land that we use and therefore help us to really improve the quality of the soil, which is a proven methodology to capture additional carbon. So not only are we avoiding carbon in the grid, we're actually reducing carbon by applying that. All of that only works if you have a proper model and the proper simulation against which you can track your progress. And we're really excited about that, what we really call regenerative energy that we can bring to all of our sites.
Thank you. That's fantastic. I didn't think about the connection. There's truly multi-physics simulation at a system level. So let me kind of ask a different kind of question, right? We have been talking about the value of simulation and so on and so forth, but what kind of risks are there in the future of simulation? So again, Patricia, I'm thinking of you, right? I mean, as you are very passionate about simulation and so on, what are some of the risks that you see on the horizon?
We're seeing it already, the increasing computing power and the ability to have this huge amount of data surrounding us and actually have virtual sensors and more predictions available to our engineers. It's now becoming quite difficult to manage for the human brain, right? So bringing all that information together in a very simple way and connecting multiple techniques, being able to bring physics-based simulation with use of the modeling, machine learning, neural networks, all of that together to make it easy for our operations to make day-to-day decisions is a huge challenge today because we are living in this world of a huge amount of data. And that's what we're focusing on at the moment. Our digital twin work is actually focusing on modularizing the technology so that we can bring many different players to offer intelligence to our operations. But at the same time, we are trying to create a simplified funnel to our engineers and operators so that they can make easy decisions. So interoperability, the ability to invest on technology without all being playing in the same space is quite important because the complexity of the energy system is going to be so high that we really need to make sure we invest our digital talent in really pushing technology forward for the industry. The complexity of the change that we are going through is quite high. So we need to be quite inventive on how we use new novel technologies for the solution of the complex problems we're facing already.
Fantastic. Thank you, Patricia. So let me now, we are about to wrap up our questions. And so I see a lot of questions coming in on the Q&A, which is fantastic. We'll get to you in 2 minutes. The final question I want to ask you, and this is really something for ANSYS, right? As CTO at ANSYS, I'm trying to look at the future of simulation, future of technology, and so on. And Dan, as you have been sort of leading this computational effort at Shell, right? What do you see simulation, how do you see simulation technology evolving in the short term, long term? And let me just give you some thoughts about what we are thinking, right? We are thinking about the use of AI, machine learning, right? And applied to simulation to accelerate simulation or make simulation easier, or high performance computing, right? Shared memory, multiprocessing, distributed memory, GPUs, or taking all these things on the cloud, or digital twins. And so there's all these directions, right? I mean, I'm literally asking you to give us input, right, at ANSYS, right? What are some of the simulation technologies that you see could help the energy industry in the short term and the long term?
Yeah, I think the challenge, I think, Prit, is going to be all of that, right? And that's going to be the real difficult thing, because I don't think I can see a world in which the technology in this space is going to get simpler. I think the capabilities are going to grow. I think the challenge for you as a provider is to make your platforms easy to use whilst taking advantage of many of these techniques. I certainly think AI is going to play a critical role. You know, we're thoroughly convinced with the developments in areas like PINs, for example, that AI is starting to enter the realm of physics very, very rapidly, and is starting to produce some really exciting results. And so the ability to bring those sorts of capabilities into simulation platforms is going to be absolutely fundamental. That requires high performance computing. And I think the elasticity of the workloads will require cloud. And so the challenge, I think, is you're going to have to stitch together solutions that can take advantage of all of those capabilities and are still user-centric and easy to use. So good luck with that.
That is exactly what we are doing. I know it's hard. I mean, we are trying to, and add on top of it the need for multi-physics, right? As Patricia talked about the reservoir simulation and so on, and how do you tie in again? Boris mentioned the weather, the sort of the solar thing intensity and so on. And we are trying to solve sort of support for multi-physics simulation, right? And again, we can do it through what we call strong coupling, weak coupling, reduced order models, and as you said, all of the above. I mean, look, we have covered a lot of
multi-scale, and don't forget multi-scale, right? It's got to be multi-scale as well.
It's sort of the grand future we are working towards is sort of multi-physics, multi-domain, multi-scale simulation, right? I mean,
that's
sort of
right.
simulating atoms to sort of rocket ships is what we can talk about. Fantastic future. This is what keeps me going. We have a lot of questions coming in from the audience. Let me kind of switch to that, and then maybe we'll go back to some of our questions. Some fantastic questions that come in. So let me take the first one. What are some of the factors that are holding back the broader deployment of simulation in the industry? Any of the panelists want to address it? It's sort of in a way risks, tied to risk and so on. Patricia, any thoughts on some of the factors that are holding back the use of simulation?
I think I mentioned one before. I think the data intensiveness of some of the simulation techniques that we need actually require data to be organized and cleaned in a way that that actually takes time to do. This is why I think the integration of simulation and digital twins, where you have done the work to clean up your data, is quite important. The integration of new sensors, so that you get new sources of information into your simulation, will be quite important. An integration with digital twins, so that you can use simulation and actually take your data back and feed the brain of your facility. will be also quite important. Your digital brain of the facility, that's what I call the data brain of the facility. So I think that those are challenges that are getting in the way of speed of simulation. And I mentioned the other one, which is the amount of information that's surrounding the ecosystem at the moment, and it's how to make it easy for our engineers to and operators to consume the information and implement the actions in a practical and an easy way. I think that integration into the ecosystem is actually something that will help us, I think, leverage more the value of simulation.
Thank you. Any of the panelists would like to answer the same question? Boris?
Yeah, Preet, I think there's maybe something to be said about who's paying for the simulation and who captures the value of the simulation. I think we've seen this early on when you think about deployment of batteries, grid scale battery, the vast value of flexible capacity on a lot of grids is with the grid operator, and is really hard to identify and monetize for the actual developer of standalone batteries. So we've seen market design changes in PJM at the East Coast, or here in CAISO in the West Coast, to help align and synchronize the value capture opportunity for the players in a certain market that drive the design and the deployment. So the more alignment you have about this, the more value you can put into precise simulation.
That's a great insight, Boris. Thank you. Never thought of it. I absolutely agree. Wow, this is phenomenal. Thank you. We have a lot of other questions coming up. So second question is, what are some of the gaps in current simulation techniques, particularly with respect to applying them in the world of sustainability? I'm going to ask Dan to maybe address that question. Gaps in simulation, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I'll try and sort of pick out a few that I think from my own experience that I see as gaps. I think the ability to really integrate simulators into real world context, I think, has been well applied in some specific domains. So you think about the classic flight simulator, for example. There are some really good examples of those sort of well-studied problems, but that ability to do that and generalize it, I think, has been really missing. So for me, it kind of goes back to the same point. It's that confluence of the real world with the physics engine, where you can actually make it representative with integrated data, and then have a lifelike simulation with a good representation of the variables that you would experience in that real scenario. And like I said, the flight simulator is the closest that I can point to as the experience that I'm looking for, but I haven't seen that extended to many domains. And even within that domain, it's quite specific. I guess another one would be the F1 car, right? You can also have very similar experiences with F1 cars, and they train on the F1 cars in those. But you know, where I think the big gap is, you can't do that on general purpose real world problems outside of those domains yet. And I think getting to that sort of simple user experience where you can actually make it very, very practical to simulate real world decision making, I think is the big gap. But as I said, the coming together of the physics and the data is going to be essential to allowing those experiences to be created. So that's the big gap for me.
Oh, that's fantastic. Great insight. Well, there are a lot of questions coming in. The challenge is to see how many questions should we answer and how many panelists can get to answer. So very important question from Daphne saying, what about data security? Are companies winning the battle? So essentially, I think, Patricia, you kind of talked about the fact that you're gathering a lot of data from all these sensors and so on, right? And as you're making decisions based on these things, that can people hack into it and make sort of some bad business outcomes coming in. So let me ask you, Patricia, What about data security? I mean, and from an oil and gas company or a renewables company, I mean, are you facing that as a challenge? What are some of the solutions? Is this a real difficulty here?
Cybersecurity is a huge priority in BP, and that's why I was mentioning our efforts into moving to data platforms, to unify data platforms that can actually help us protect that data and protect and create barriers safety barriers to prevent those risks. So we're doing a lot. There's an organization in BP, and actually everyone in BP has a massive role. We get trained every day. We actually get loads of phishing attempts just to trial and test how aware every single employee in BP is on preventing cyber risks. So we get a lot of actions regularly on that. But one thing that I will say is quite important is that move to a cloud-enabled platform business, that where your data is organized and clean and centralized is quite important, because it prevents the local deployments and it prevents the one-offs deployments in many different parts of the world that will create risks. That's actually where that the standardization, the centralization of our data is at the core of preventing risks, I think, and enabling simulation at pace and enabling all of this work that we have been talking about. So it's not just an action to optimize how we use simulation, but also to prevent risks in the cyberspace.
Fantastic. We have a very interesting, broad societal question from Julia. Given that the United Nations is actually meeting this week, this is the right question. So the question is from Julia, and I would like Boris to give try to address it. Do you think that there is a real international commitment by the states to have a cleaner future for our kids? And will they support financially the energy sector? I mean, great question, right? So essentially, I mean, every leader, right? I mean, Narendra Modi from India, right? He said, oh, we'll be carbon neutral by 2070. Every country is saying all these things, right? Just because it makes it look good, right? But the question is, do they really, is there a true commitment, and will they support financially? So this is at the core of your business, the Silicon Branch. Boris,
being a stubborn optimist, I think the short answer is yes. And the reason why is I'm a firm believer, if you set your horizon long enough and your lens wide enough, what's the right thing to do and what's the profitable thing to do is the same thing. And I think we've come a long way in our industry collectively, be it from a government perspective, be it from an industry perspective, but more importantly, be it from a consumer or customer perspective, like our customers at Google and Meta and Volkswagen, you name it, they are really pulling us along, right? So the customer-led drive for tackling climate change and really helping us identify ways to monetize the good that we do. And customers were front and center when it came to power purchase agreements in the solar industry, right? So to really create these long-term incentives for the deployment. We see the same thing now when it comes to direct scope 3, and power purchase agreement only tackles scope 2. But even scope 3, when we think about our carbon management, the ClearLoop, we see customers, partners like Rivian, who drive us along and pull us in as our carbon partners. And we are not only seeing this in the US, right? So this is a global phenomenon. So in a nutshell, I think Julie was her name, I'm optimistic and confident. And go to clearloop.us if you want to learn more. And you can see how actually our simulation plays out for consumers and customers in real life.
Fantastic. Hey, I was going to ask you a question to all of you panelists, but again, it has to be a very brief answer. The Department of Energy in the US has identified these sort of moonshots, right? What are the future directions in energy? And they call it actually Earth charts. And they have identified 3 broad areas. One is, can you solve problems for carbon negative, right? Not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative, right? So any solutions for carbon neutral is interesting. The second area they kind of talked about is hydrogen, right? And again, hydrogen is really important area. And the third one is long-term storage, which is tied to Boris. So rapid fire. So thoughts on these earth shots, right? On just how important do you think carbon capture, carbon negative, hydrogen, long-term storage is to you, Patricia? 30 seconds.
The energy system needs to be decarbonized, and we all know that, and it cannot be solved with a single answer. So all of those things have to be in the picture, which is why the inventiveness of everyone, governments, corporations, cities, regions, everyone needs to be part of the change. This is a very complex change. So I think all of it needs to be part of it. That's why the complexity that we are facing now in this transition.
Thank you. Dan, 30 seconds on these 3 earth shots from Department of Energy. I think Dan is, yeah.
I totally agree with you. That you're spot on. I think there's a lot of these things that are going to be required and more. And I think the energy system of the future is going to be inherently very, very complex. And maybe I'll use the opportunity to bring it back. I think actually the most important thing in the energy system of the future is developing digital solutions that are going to help us to manage a far more complex energy system, because the energy system of today is quite simple. The energy system of the future is going to have all these things in it. And the challenge is, how do you manage a system that complex?
Boris, final thoughts?
When you look at the last 20 years and the learning curve for PV panels, I think the cost dropped around 90% to 95%, depending on what base year you're using. So the earth shots will help us collectively with deployment-led innovation. And so it will be a key pillar of driving us towards the energy transition.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists for their great insights. I want to pass it over to Luke to wrap up the panel.
Thank you very much, Prith, and thank you to Dan and to Patricia and Boris as well for your input. I think that was a fascinating discussion, very timely and thoroughly interesting. So thank you all again for your participation. That concludes today's webinar. So thank you to all of our audience for joining us and for submitting your questions. Make sure to stay tuned for some further energy content throughout the year ahead. And we look forward to seeing you at another of our webinars and another of our events sometime soon. Until then, we'll say goodbye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.